Now on nights, Health Matters, thanks to the Sydney Adventist Hospital. Healthcare, education, research. Yours for life.
Each week, one of the great professionals from the SAN joins us, and this week, I'm really interested in this one, National Stroke Week. It's being held this week. There's a theme, it's called United by Stroke, uniting us in learning more about the signs of stroke. They say FAST, face, arms, speech and time. Now, in 2020, last year, around 27,500 Australians affected by stroke for the first time in their lives. It means that every 19 minutes, someone had a stroke. And there are around 400,000 people living with the effects of a stroke. It's one of our major killers. Many people don't know it actually kills more women than breast cancer and more men than prostate cancer. And I know, I don't need to even, I know for sure that there'll be people listening to us tonight who are survivors of stroke, and they're in various stages. Some survive completely, others are debilitated to an extent. But let's find out more. Professor John Watson is a neurologist from the SAN. He joins us. Professor, good evening to you.
Good evening, John. It's very nice of you to have me on your show.
We're looking forward to this because I know I could probably think of half a dozen people over the last 20 years that I've come into contact with. In some cases, they've had fatal strokes. In others, it's been a stroke from which they've recovered really well. So I want to go through all of that with you. But as a starting point, what causes a stroke? What's happening when someone has one?
There's two main causes of a stroke. The commonest cause in our society is a blockage of an artery. So if an artery, then that's the vessel that takes blood with oxygen from the heart to the brain, in this case, that's an artery. If it gets blocked off, that causes all the tissue in the brain that's been supplied by that artery to be damaged and in bad cases to be destroyed. We call that either a thrombotic stroke or an embolic stroke. A thrombotic stroke is where the clot actually forms at that point in the brain. An embolic stroke, which is a whole interesting area that relates the heart to the brain, that happens when a clot is formed, usually in the heart, and gets thrown off into the brain. And those two causes account for about 85% of stroke in our society. We call them ischemic strokes.
Right.
There's another form of stroke where the primary problem is a bleed, a catastrophic bleed into the brain, if you like, a burst vessel in layman's terms. And they are caused by bleeding from an artery into the brain. And they, in our society, they account for about 15% of strokes.
Right, okay. And look, how do we know from the outside or the person, I mean, the FAST signs we should look for, either as the victim or someone who's watching on?
Yeah, so all the stroke authorities around the world are promoting this little acronym FAST, F-A-S-T, to help people to work out if someone's having a stroke. So F stands for face, and that means you look at the person or they look at themselves in the mirror and they see if there's a droop in the face, if one side of the face is drooped down. The next thing is arms, A for arms. Ask the person to hold both arms up, and if one side looks weak, that's an arm sign. The S stands for speech. A lot of people would work this out pretty quickly. If there's some sort of difficulty in speaking, if the speech is slurred or they can't get their words out or they're using incorrect words, that's a speech problem. The T here is a reminder that time is critical, and we want to do something about it quickly. You might be surprised, a lot of people have a stroke or the beginning of a stroke, and because it's painless, unlike something like a heart attack, they often sort of almost ignore it or hope it goes away. And I've looked after many people who've had the signs one evening, but they thought, oh, well, I don't know what this is. I'll wait till the morning. So time is very important because we know that with every minute, we can lose more and more brain cells when someone's had a stroke.
Yeah, you've just explained that time-critical situation. So is there a general rule in terms of you think, I think I've had a stroke, How much time do you have? When do you need intervention? What should you do?
Ideally, you should get to your nearest large hospital as fast as you can, and ambulance service is almost certainly the way to go. We've got good evidence that people who arrive by ambulance with advanced warning, the ambulance rings ahead when they have a stroke, on what we colloquially call the bat phone. Those people get access to workup and treatment more quickly than if they go to their GP or take themselves in by private transport. I'm not saying you would never do that, but that's a very good thing to ring the ambulance. We've got some treatments that we can use for acute stroke. We've got clot-busting drugs where we can put a special drug into the vein, and that can make a huge difference to some people's outcomes. We know that those drugs work for up to 4.5 hours, in some cases even 6 hours after the stroke. But that's no reason to wait 4.5 hours or 6 hours. If we graph the benefit, as you might expect, it's the maximum benefit straight away, and that fades out. We've also got newer techniques for removing clot. We've got very accomplished colleagues called interventional neuroradiologists. These are colleagues who put catheters through the groin, up the vessels, into the brain, into the arteries. They can find the clot and they can extract it with little devices that pull clot out. Incredible. And we do have up to 6 hours, even longer in some cases, to restore the blood supply that way. So we've got 2 or 3 excellent early treatments where time is critical.
Yeah, and just to reflect, so we talk about face, arm, speech. So the face droops, the speech becomes slurred, your arms droop. So you would think if that happens, you'd be pretty aware that something dramatic's happened. So okay, because people might think, I might be paranoid. Well, I'm not going to ring an ambulance. I'll wait for this to go away. You're saying if all those things come together, you have to act.
Yeah, and I and my colleagues would not mind if we get rung and called out of bed. For people where it's not turned out to be a stroke with those symptoms and signs, because we know that we can make a huge difference. And getting people in early is better than getting them in late. Yeah,
of course. And look, the symptoms and signs, you can have them and then they disappear after, a few minutes in some cases. Is that right?
Yes. Now, that's known in the trade as a transient, meaning short-lived, ischemic attack, a TIA. And those are stroke-like episodes, but they might only last for a few minutes and the person's made a complete recovery. To use another analogy, you've probably heard of people having angina, chest pain with effort, and then some of those people later will have an actual heart attack, a myocardial infarct. So TIAs correspond to angina. They're the angina of the brain, if you like. And so what we do know is that those people who've had TIAs should be seen and investigated as quickly as if they've had a stroke.
Yes.
And we usually find factors that we can do something about, modifiable risk factors. We do know that a significant number of people who've had a full-blown stroke have had a warning little stroke or TIA and may not have acted upon it.
Yep.
So it's a fantastic opportunity, if in a perverse way perhaps, to do something that might actually prevent a full-blown stroke coming later on.
Yeah, I want to get to what people can do, but just on the question of what happens, because it's a huge area and there are a range of effects, but in general terms, what happens to the brain after a stroke, and then what's the recovery process like, and can there be a full recovery?
We still don't know everything that happens after a stroke, but the first thing is the brain is the most sensitive organ in the body, and even a few minutes without adequate blood or oxygen leads to damage. And then all sorts of other things go on that cause toxicity to the brain cells.
Yes.
So we do know that that's what goes on in the brain, and eventually at the very centre of the stroke area, there'll be an area or a region of the brain that is irreversibly damaged, and that ends up down the track, causing a scar, if you like. Around that, however, there is an area of brain tissue that is limping along. It's getting some blood and some oxygen and some glucose, not enough for the long term, but just enough to tick over. And that's the it's a bit like an onion skin. That's the outer aspect. And a lot of what happens with recovery is when we're able to restore blood supply early enough that area of the brain that is injured or damaged and at risk for permanent destruction is saved. And that can happen over more than a few minutes.
Yes.
We also know that parts of the brain have what's called a brain or neuronal plasticity, the idea that new circuits to work around the problem can be formed. And there are some parts of the brain where that's much more likely to happen. And there's no question the plasticity of the brain is more likely to occur in younger people than older people. We do know that, however, people will recover meaningful function in many cases for a considerable period of time, 2, even 3 or 4 years after a stroke.
Yes.
And this is where our colleagues in rehabilitation, physiotherapy, speech pathology, occupational therapy get involved. So we don't yet have drugs that work in humans to reduce the size of a stroke, although goodness knows we've been doing trials of those sorts of drugs for nearly 30 years now.
Yes.
We don't yet have anything like that. We don't yet have anything scientifically based along the line of stem cell therapy and so on that might make a difference. But most people in this area believe that those sorts of ideas will probably be our next breakthroughs.
Yeah, that would be very exciting. Look, I've got a few minutes left. I just want to just quickly go through this because we've gone through what happens. You see someone's had a stroke, you've called the ambulance. So is there anything you can do while you're waiting for that ambulance to arrive?
Yes. Well, first of all, obviously reassurance and speak to the person. Know you've rung the ambulance, you're helping out. Mm. It's good not to give anyone anything give the person anything to eat or drink, because some of those treatments I've told you about require a general anaesthetic,
yes.
And we don't want people to eat or drink before a general anaesthetic.
That's good. Yep.
You would try and lie them down on a bed or on the floor with a pillow, keeping the head up slightly if you can. You would want to make sure that they can breathe all right, they don't have restrictive clothing. If you think someone's unconscious, then you should put them in what's called the recovery position, which many people know, that's sort of half on the side. Mm. And if you felt that they really were in trouble and you couldn't get a pulse going, couldn't detect a pulse, then you should start CPR,
yes,
cardiopulmonary. But that's very unusual in the context of stroke. The only other thing to be sure to perhaps flag is that if someone's got major paralysis of an arm or a leg, and many people know that that's a key aspect of stroke, you've got to be pretty careful in helping this person to move or roll over or position them, because you could damage a joint or dislocate a joint.
Of course, yep.
So just be a little bit careful moving them around, because they can't move their own arm or leg.
Yeah, we're all hoping we don't have to use this, but it's very good advice. And just finally, can we obviously being healthy, living a healthy lifestyle, eating better has got to help, but is there a way you can identify if you're at risk of stroke? Is there something you need to do in terms of preventative stuff?
Yes. So particularly through general practitioners, people can do regular health checks. There's no question, everyone probably knows that as we get older, our risk of stroke goes up, as it does for heart attack, and risk factors become more and more important. We can't do anything about our age, but we certainly can make sure we get our blood pressures checked regularly, yes, and treated. We know that even in Australia, which is a very good country in worldwide figures for the identification and treatment of blood pressure, we probably don't adequately treat at least half the people with blood pressure. That's almost certainly the biggest thing we could do, is to check blood pressure, do everything we can to keep the blood pressure as low as possible, by medication if necessary. But another thing that's worth talking about is salt consumption. Our diet, particularly with processed food, but surprisingly with things like bread, is very high in salt. And there's plenty of studies to show that if people reduce their salt intake, we can dramatically reduce the effect of blood pressure and then the likelihood of stroke and, of course, heart attack, because they have the same sort of risk.
Yes, of course. Most interesting tonight. Thank you so much. And you're in a field where I guess there's so much ahead. We're learning more about the brain all the time. I do know that. And as you've flagged, there's so many treatments that are still being worked on. But right now, that was most interesting in Stroke Week, and I think we need to remember it. And for those who've gone through all of this, it's really important. You've got to act very, very quickly. That word fast is really critical to all of this. Professor Watson, lovely to talk to you. Thank you, and good luck for the future.
And thank you very much for having me on your program.